Thank you very much, Rebecca. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all connected. Really glad that we are having this conversation on a very important topic. You know that the COP is happening as we speak, and there are a lot of conversations about this specific topic, the increased occurrence and intensity of heat waves and how this is impacting the world and development. Now, the years 2023, 24, and 25 have been the hottest in our planet's history, according to the World Meteorological Organization. According to recent studies published in the Lancet, almost 500,000 of deaths are happening every year because of heat wave. So this is definitely a very serious and important topic we need to embrace. Now, what does it mean in a sector like transport? Transport is very vulnerable to natural disasters. This is something that we've learned over and over. Transport infrastructure are very capital intensive. They are vulnerable to not only to heat, to rain. What we used to say, the water is the worst enemy of the road. But I think we could say something similar to with heat. And heat is causing a lot of constraints on transport infrastructure, but also on services. And so over the past years, I think the notion of resilient transport has emerged and has become a key priority. For what we do, we receive a lot of requests from our clients, sometimes more in a reactive way, in response to natural disasters after the damage has occurred. But more and more, we try to engage on a preventive way. And so what can be done to make sure that transport infrastructure, but beyond transport systems, are more resilient. And that can mean several things. It can mean the redesigning infrastructure, rethinking the standards, thinking about the materials, the way we build those infrastructure. It can mean thinking in terms of networks. And so not only looking at a particular stretch of road, but thinking ahead what happens if connectivity is interrupted. And so we've developed at the World Bank a number of analytical tools that can screen transport networks and assess their vulnerability and find some strategies to think about on this. How do we ensure, especially for those countries, I'm thinking about a number of countries in Africa, which are landlocked and often relying on one single logistic corridor to trade everything. And so these becomes a little bit the lifeline and the backbone of those countries. So having this criticality analysis of transport networks is also a very important way to make sure that transport can cope with heat waves and any other adaptation challenge that countries are facing. And finally, I would say the third topic, which is very strategic, is maintenance. How to make sure that those expensive assets that are roads, railways, and other transport infrastructure are properly maintained. There was some work that was done jointly, actually, by the Transport and the Environment GP a couple of years back, that concluded that the cost of maintenance is likely to triple in the coming decade as a result of climate change. And the reason is very simple. Roads need to be repaired more often. The damages are greater. And so this mechanically increases the cost of maintenance. It's a very serious issue because maintenance in many countries is financed through specific mechanisms. Many countries have put in place road funds that are financed through earmarked gasoline taxes. And so you have to rethink the whole maintenance system in anticipation of those impacts. So these are some of the from where I'm standing, some of the issues that I see in relation to the topic. And so I'm really, really glad that we joined forces to think together about how to help our client countries. I know in today's session, we will be hearing some case studies from Kenya and South Africa, which are based on real life experience of how those countries are coping with the impact of heat waves on the urban transportation system. Yeah, I'm very confident that from today's conversation, we'll find some actionables that will and policy measures that will help us guide our countries to deal with this development challenge. So I want to thank all the colleagues who worked on this report, and also Professor Ukusuri, who is joining us. I'm very glad that we broadened the audience today from colleagues from the academia, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. So the way we will start is we have 3 presentations, and the first one is Professor Satish Ukusuri, professor at Purdue University and the lead author of the Heat Waves and Transport Systems Reports and Issue Note. Professor Ukusuri, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I hope everyone can see the slides. So what I want to share with you this morning.
Not yet. Could you? Not yet. Now we can see them. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm actually in India right now, so there might be some delay. And so it's a great pleasure to share the work that we actually have done on heat waves and transport. So there is a lot to unpack here. What I hope to do in 10 minutes that I've been given is to just give you some of the key findings that we actually have across different modes of transportation and how we should take a proactive approach towards addressing heat waves and transportation across the entire life cycle. As Nicola set the stage for us, I think heat is a silent killer. It's a very important disaster. It doesn't get the recognition it deserves as compared to earthquakes and flooding and so on, but it does affect every aspect of transportation. And what we have seen is that this is growing as temperatures are increasing across the world, and there's a increasing stress on transportation infrastructure, but not just on the infrastructure, but also the users and the managers of these systems, right? So here are 3 examples from some of the World Bank projects that are actually ongoing in Dakar, where there's an increasing heat stress on the rail system. And in Egypt, in Cairo, there's an increasing number of heat days, which increases the risk due to maintenance costs. And then in Dhaka, similarly, the number of heat days have been increasing. And here in panel B, we can see the number of projected extreme heat days, which are expected to increase by almost 2 times in some of the cities which are closer to the equator. Right, so we can kind of see that these projections to 2030 and 2050 are going to cause significant effects on the transportation systems, but not just in cities in South Asia and Africa, but also in Europe, where you don't really think of heat stress. We see that there are going to be increased number of extreme heat days, which is going to change how we plan, how we think about maintenance related to transportation systems. So what we have done, we have convened an expert panel to synthesize the knowledge related to heat waves. And we have kind of compiled together literature review of more than 1,000 plus papers, reports, and blogs. And we have conducted about more than 6 different thematic panels addressing different model issues, looking at different ways in which we could kind of understand both the direct and indirect impacts of heat waves, and really converging towards a proactive agenda towards addressing heat and transport related issues, right? So we synthesized various experience related to heat waves and transport. We looked at what are the different types of research needs and gaps that are currently there, and how some cities are actually taking action in terms of both creating awareness, but also creating some priority strategies in terms of addressing heat and transportation, right? And transportation, it's not just about infrastructure, it's about users, it's about addressing vulnerable users, right? So, and it's also looking at the maintenance and workforce that is actually using these transportation systems. And when we look at heat impacts, we need to discuss the different ways in which comfort is actually measured, and what is the baseline for actually looking at temperature measurements. The one is the daily maximum temperature, which is actually the thermometer temperature, which is actually recorded. But the more important one is this PET and the wet bulb globe temperature, which accounts for not just the air temperature, but also the mean radiant temperature and the humidity, right? And which kind of accounts for some of the comfort related variables that are there when looking at heat, right? So, and it also kind of looks at the moisture, which is actually important when we're looking at maintenance of transportation systems, right? So we are primarily going to look at the WBGT temperature when looking at many of these reports in the synthesis that we actually have done. So moving on, so looking at different impacts, both the direct and indirect impacts, and some of the key mitigation strategies related to each of these different modes. The first one here is how roads are actually impacted due to the heat stress. Some direct impacts are in terms of this pavement life cycle and the increased maintenance costs that was brought up by Nicola, right? And what we have seen is the typical life cycle of a pavement is about 20 years. And due to increases in temperature, this could reduce to 6 to 7 years, which means it triples the cost that we actually have in terms of the maintenance of this infrastructure. And typical type of direct impacts include rotting due to these increased temperatures, alligator cracks, which are increased with every 2 degrees rise in temperature and is significant in coastal areas. And then material degradation of both the asphalt as well as the concrete pavements, which increases the maintenance costs that are there, right? So some key strategies in terms of mitigating these types of impacts include better materials, which can absorb some of this heat in terms of thermochromatic materials, looking at biomaterials and evapotranspirative type of materials, which can reflect much of this heat back into the atmosphere. And these are things, some of them are more mature in terms of implementation, some of them are still in testing stages. Then rail heat challenges. Rail is one important mode which has seen significant number of studies, significant number of impacts in terms of the heat. Issues include buckling and track maintenance, which increases during heat wave periods, right? And then there's operational impacts, which is primarily due to signal failures. Extreme heat causes rail signal failures and fire risk on the rail infrastructure. This has direct impacts in terms of operations. It increases the delay on the tracks. It reduces the speed of these trains, which again increases the delays for passengers, right? And so there is a issue of both the cascading of both the material type of issues with operational type of impacts. And then overhead systems, there is a sagging of this overhead systems once it exceeds 38 degrees centigrade, causing service disruptions. The rail resilience is also important from a structural point of view. In terms of track systems, we need better IoTs and sensors so that we can kind of track the heat and so that we can kind of understand how to be proactive in terms of the heat stress on these tracks. And track support infrastructure, where we have better vegetation on the embankments and heat resistant materials for overhead lines. In terms of operations, some of these mitigation strategies include better implementation of heat-based speed limits, like having dynamic speed limits so that the speed is adjusted based upon the weather conditions. And looking at better HVAC systems and for the rolling stock, phasing out some of the older stock which is actually there and creating heat resistant components in terms of using this rolling stock, right? And having a clear schedule maintenance by having better forecasting systems so that you're ahead of these heat waves when you're planning your operational schedule. In public transit system, right, there are multiple levels of disruption. Direct impacts include bus fires, which we have seen in India, where tires have been blown out in some of these buses when temperatures exceed 48 degrees centigrade, right? Station infrastructure not having shelters, causing extreme heat stress for people who are using these stations. And in Europe, in the London rail system, there's trapped heat issues, increasing heat stress, both for the workforce as well as for users of the subway systems, right? And then there are also indirect and operational impacts in these public transit systems. We see reliability issues in terms of increased breakdown, decreased ridership, people not wanting to take public transit because of the inconvenience and switching to driving, which increases emissions, right? And then high impacts on vulnerable communities, right? So heat doesn't affect the entire community in the same way. The vulnerable population, like elderly and low income, actually face the brunt of it. So we need to kind of really account for some of these comfort standards when we are looking at the design of these systems. Some mitigation strategies here for public transit include better station and shelter improvements in terms of better design. One of our speakers is actually going to talk about that. Better powered cooling and shade infrastructure, and looking at better HVAC upgrades and heat mitigation type of technologies in terms of real-time monitoring of temperatures in the transit stations and metro stations, and better vehicle fleet improvements using onboard HVAC systems. We again have seen some of this in India and South Africa, and fleet replacement in terms of phase out of this heat vulnerable stock, and better maintenance of this infrastructure itself, right? And in terms of operational strategies, scheduling the adjustments, so adjusting the schedule of these buses to by better forecasting to less heat intensive time periods, and also training staff based upon these heat protocols. These are some strategies which have been done in cities. Active transportation, we see this both pedestrians and bicyclists significantly impacted by heat waves. And what we see is in addition to the direct impacts due to the heat waves, we see that there are behavioral and systemic shifts that actually do happen, people changing the mode of travel, shortening the travel, reducing the distances that they actually travel, or sometimes completely abandoning these trips. And just as we discussed before, equity is an important issue here. Low-income communities often have less tree coverage and are not really suitable for active transportation type of modes. So looking at, we have scanned cities across the globe to see what cities are actually doing in terms of heat adaptation to the transportation systems and what strategies and what actionable things these cities are doing. Here is a quick snapshot of 4 cities which are actually doing various types of strategies addressing heat and transport. Singapore has been working on a 2030 plan in terms of creating more green spaces and green infrastructure, creating more accessibility to green walkways within a 10-minute walkway. So their accessibility metric is like within 10 minutes, everyone should be able to access a green walkway, and using cool paints to kind of reduce temperatures by about 2 degrees, right? So these are some things Singapore has been working on. In India, Ahmedabad, which is a city in Western India, they have done some heat action plans due to significant number of fatalities that have been happened over the last 15 years. And they have trained their workforce to kind of take different types of mitigation strategies, such as providing hydration for people, cooling of police workers who are standing in heat or exposed to heat for a very long time periods, retrofitting the transit fleet, and so on. Similarly, in Argentina, there have been community leadership training and early warning systems that have been built to account for the heat waves, and then also creating new building codes to reduce the impacts of this heat. In Europe, there's a Euro Heat 8-step framework, which is EU is part of this, where they actually have a strategy to address heat in every phase of the transportation systems. And they have about 7 chief heat city officers appointed globally and a heat health action plans that have actually been developed. So this is one of our key deliverables from the issue note and the report that we actually have come up with. This is a forward-looking, actionable plan of how heat resilient transport systems need to be looked at, right? So there are a lot of things here, and I'll just try to summarize quickly in the time that I actually have. And this is a critical pathway type of an approach where a city, once they actually have done their baseline assessment, can really take strategies depending upon their constraints, their resources that are actually available, and they can start at whichever point it makes sense for them, right? So there are some low-cost investment strategies that many cities can actually do, which is to standardize heat metrics and implement certain warning systems in conjunction with identifying climate projections and investigating various types of transportation system investments. So this type of a baseline assessment is something which is, I think, what we're recommending for many of the cities to actually do with respect to their transportation systems. The next level would be to kind of look at the infrastructure investments and see how they can make their infrastructure heat resistant once they have a baseline assessment of where they are and what type of climate effects are there on the transport systems. And then looking at things like green infrastructure, how can you have trees that are planted next to your public transportation system? We have seen cities which actually have planted trees on top of the public transportation system. So looking at various ways in which they could kind of greenify their corridors would be another type of a infrastructure investment to kind of consider. And then the third tier would be to kind of look at governance and equity in conjunction with tier 1 and tier 2, explicitly address some of the gaps, equity gaps that might be there in their system, and develop heat action plans with a better forecasting system and train their workforce in terms of how to kind of implement these heat action plans. And finally, knowledge and capacity. Close these research gaps and build institutional capacity, work closely with the institutions, and develop specific roles in these cities that can take charge of this proactive vision that is there and make sure that the implementation is ahead of the things that are actually happening, right? So this is the type of a critical pathway, a forward-looking agenda that we actually have put together. Happy to discuss this further. And finally, I think inaction is not an option for us, right? So heat adaptation is no longer an optional thing. It is something which is very important in terms of economic consequences. It is important in terms of many of the SDGs that we actually reviewed. And this is one adaptation pathway for the operations and management costs. At the very basic, you can kind of do like trees next to bus stops or trees next to bus stops and planting over bus shelters. At the high end, you can kind of retrofit your entire fleet with new HVAC systems and planting over the bus shelters and doing a lot of other things in terms of your adaptive pathways. Right? So these are some very concrete steps in which you could kind of operationalize the knowledge that we actually have put together in this particular framework. So I'm happy to kind of take questions. I'm happy to get into more details, but this is a brief summary of what we have in the issue note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satish, for this comprehensive overview and also the critical paths forward. We take all questions at the end. We have some time for Q&A. For now, I would like to introduce the next speaker, Kiko Kishwe, who is the TTL for the Kenya Urban Mobility Improvement Project. And she will show what heat resilience can look like in practice for heat resilient heat resilient station facilities in Nairobi. Over to you, Akiko.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Can you see my slide? I'm not sure.
See your slides.
Yes, I'm trying to make it a presentation mode.
Yeah,
Yes.
we can
Is
see
it
your
come?
slides.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. And then today I would like to share the overview of the heat analysis and the design strategies under the Kenya Urban Mobility Improvement Project. And then our task team received the fantastic technical support for this analytical piece from the urban heat team in the City Resilience Program and the GFDRR, led by Nicholas Jones and Nuala Kwan. We are currently preparing this COMIP, Kenya Urban Mobility Improvement Project. And then this project is to aim to improve mobility, accessibility, and then safety, and to create a job opportunity in the vicinity of the commuter rail line, Nairobi Central Station to the down to the north in the Thika Station. And then project is aiming to upgrading this 57 kilometer of existing the commuter rail, and then the station area development along this corridor for the urban regeneration. And why we need to consider the heat in the COMIP. Actually, Nairobi has a subtropical highland climate. So the temperature here is rarely below 13 degrees Celsius, which is around 50 Fahrenheit, or above the 30 degrees Celsius, 86 Fahrenheit. So it's very, we are very nice environment, the climate. However, that as the Professor Satish already mentioned, that still rain can be buckled at below 50 degrees Celsius, and then can be happen at the 30 degree Celsius in the daytime temperature, because rail surface can exceed air temperature by 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. Then also the heat can negatively impact on the passengers' health and comfort and the railway operations. Then the previous presentation mentioned that heat is not well recognized as the other the risks. For the Nairobi, biggest risk is a flood. However, like impact of heat is really getting the and important, and we try to address this risk to the transport sector in Kenya. So this study is to understand how the current and the future heat stress condition could affect the passenger comfort, and then we try to identify the design option for the new and or the upgraded station. Then they also identify the practical actions for the heat resilient facilities. So the first we carried out the heat analysis for the Nairobi metropolitan area, which the project gonna be taking place. And then this analysis indicated that we will have more hot days by today's standard. Sorry, for us, 30 degrees is already very hot. Yeah, and then we also need to be ready for the extremely hot days, which is 35 plus. So this result really indicate that it is important for us to think how rail station design can be enhanced to maintain functionality, ridership, and the user satisfaction in hotter context. And we also checked land surface temperature along the railway line that we intend to invest. This is a ticker line of the 57 kilometer, and then the analysis basically indicated that while the temperature vary along the railway corridor, but the surface temperature can be up to 10 degrees Celsius above the system-wide average. So then this study used the Universal Thermal Climate Index to gauge when the passenger feel comfortable and when they are at the risk of heat stress. And given that Nairobi is really blessed with a mild climate, we have slightly adjusted this Universal Thermal Climate Index for the Nairobi context. So for us, 16 to 20 degrees Celsius is considered in the comfort zone. And then we examine the 6 factors that affect outdoor comfort: air temperature, humidity, solar radiation, sky conditions, rain, and wind. We also selected the time frame that is relevant to traveling. So we agreed that the 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. is for our analysis. And the analysis indicated that currently, during the daytime hour, in the fully exposed condition, half of the time, temperatures fall within 16 to 26 degrees Celsius, the comfort zone. However, based on the modeling result for the 2019 under the shared socioeconomic pathway 5, the result indicated that the perceived temperature could be 5 to 7%, 7 degrees Celsius higher than today. And this means that the passenger waiting outdoor will increasingly face uncomfortable feet. And then the comfort zone will be reduced from 50 to 31%, and then also the around 20% of the time passenger experience very strong heat stress, which is currently only 1%. So without the intervention, Nairobi's commuter rail station could become significantly uncomfortable for the passenger at any key hours. So then design strategy for thermal comfort for Nairobi Rail. And the 5 strategy has been identified, which are solar shading, wind access, cool materials, vegetation, and enhanced wind. For the passive cooling that can inform the design for the new stations or retrofitted in the existing stations. And then as you can see from this graph, biggest impact will come from shade. Even like a well ventilated platform can bring only the 31% of the daytime hours. But if we combine the shade and the wind, we can increase the comfort up to 86%. And then we also looked at both 2 and 3 platform configuration. Here we are showing that the 2 platform configuration with the different conditions. And then we modeled that for the central platform is assumed 10 meter wide for the 3 platform configuration and 5 meter for the 2 platform configuration. And the model included the 3 meter roof height, 5 meter roof height, and 5 meter roof plus building, and that provide additional shade. And then for each strategy, we provided, recommended actions as presented in this slide. And in the conclusion, the thermal comfort at the railway station is not only the good for the comfortable, the comfort for the passenger, but that's also contribute to the higher ridership and the increased revenue. And then also that has a good impact, positive impact to the local economy activity around the stations. And then also response to the climate resilience. And then what we are proposing is a small design choices. And if that happened in the early stage of the design, that can also save better the investment. And then due to the time constraint, I did not go for the detail. It's really the give this presentation is to give the overview of what we have done, but we are now discussing with the Nick's team to publish this study. So hopefully that soon that we can share this report for those who is interested in. And then thanks to this analytical work supported by the urban heat team, I really see that the client is now designing that access road to station, incorporating that heater element. And then I understand the Nick's team is available for further consultation for any team that interested in this type of analysis. So that anyone who has any question for the project, please reach out to me, and anything for the heat analysis, maybe it would be great to reach out to the Nick and the Nuala. Thank you very much.
Very much, Akiko, for showcasing this project, which really beautifully illustrates all these measures. Our next speaker is Bradley Riley. He's a consultant with GFDRR based in South Africa, and he has been leading the work on heat exposure in the minibus sector in South Africa. Over to you, Bradley.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Let me just pull my slides up. Let me know when you can see on your side.
See.
Okay, great. Perfect. Thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks so much for the opportunity to share some of this work. So I'm Bradley Riley, a consultant with the GFDRR, and I'm based in the South African office. And I'll just introduce some of the work we've been doing on heat exposure in South Africa's minibus taxi sector. And this work we did in partnership with the South African National Treasury City Support Program, and it was supported by SECO. So just to provide a bit of a background and overview on the minibus taxi sector in South Africa, it's a largely informal sector, but it's really the backbone of South Africa's public transport. So around 2/3 of all households actually rely on this mode of transport. There's over 16 million people that use taxis daily. There's more than 280,000 minibus taxis in operation, and it supports an informal economy of nearly 1 million jobs, from drivers and marshals to fuel attendants and street vendors. I wanted to introduce this concept of thermal comfort, but I think the previous speakers beat me to it. So I'm not going to touch too much on this slide. I think what is important to note is that our body works really hard to maintain a stable temperature. And you can see the graphic on the left there just shows how our body reacts to different environmental conditions. And when this balance is lost, it affects how our body actually functions, and it becomes a health risk and health issue. So prolonged heat exposure can cause heat-related illnesses such as headaches, diseases, and heat exhaustion, and even heat stroke. And it can also worsen chronic conditions like your cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. Our vulnerable groups who are most at risk include the elderly, the children, pregnant women, and there's a lot of research and studies now coming out about the risk and impacts of heat exposure and preterm and stillbirth. And then obviously those with chronic illnesses are also most at risk. And specifically for the taxi sector, drivers and commuters are facing fatigue and health risks on a daily basis, and it's really threatening their public health and transport safety ultimately. So this is really where our study came from, and it looked at heat exposure in the minibus taxi sector in the city of Durban. And this work was commissioned in collaboration with the South African Medical Research Council, and ultimately to understand heat exposure on drivers and commuters within this sector. So are drivers and commuters exposed to extreme heat, and to what extent? How does heat inside taxis and taxi ranks compare to outdoor conditions? And what adaptation actions and investment options can reduce exposure? But why does this matter? So drivers and commuters spend long hours in taxis and at taxi ranks. It's actually estimated that drivers spend about 10 hours a day in their vehicle. So extreme heat causes thermal discomfort, as I mentioned, leading to these heat-related health illnesses. Heat stress has also been linked to reduction in concentration and performance, so it's increasing the risk of driving errors. And designing for comfort and resilience makes the sector safer and user-friendly. But what does that look like? So this just provides a bit of an overview of how this study was designed and how it came together. So ultimately, we installed eye buttons or temperature recorders in 16 taxis and 12 taxi ranks, measuring the temperature and humidity hourly over a 5-day period. So about 2,250 data points were collected and then used to calculate what we call apparent temperature or the real field temperature. So it really just brings the temperature and humidity metrics together. And the results are quite stark from the get-go. The temperatures inside the taxis and the taxi ranks were consistently higher than outdoor temperatures. And I'll go into a bit more detail in the next few slides. So this first slide looks at the heat exposure inside the taxis. So this graphic here just provides the hourly temperature measurements recorded in the 16 taxis across the 5-day period. And it basically just shows that the temperature ranges were from at minimum 24 degrees Celsius to a maximum of 39 degrees Celsius, averaging around 27 degrees, which is consistently higher and above your typical comfort levels, which are around 25 to 27 degrees Celsius. We then compared heat exposure across different environments. So this graphic here basically just shows the different contexts of your outdoor temperature, showing the blue line, the taxi rank temperature in the green line, and the inside taxi temperature on the red line. And straight away, you can see that both the taxis and taxi ranks recorded hotter temperatures than outdoors. So taxi ranks had interiors averaging around 6 degrees higher, and taxi ranks averaged around 3 degrees higher. So this is really, really evident. But what does this mean? So inside taxis, we say that we mentioned that the temperatures exceeded outdoor conditions by more than 6 degrees Celsius. At taxi ranks, although they were slightly cooler, the ranks still reached up to 35 degrees Celsius, and there's very limited shading and cooling options available. So around 70% of the observed taxi ranks and infrastructure that we saw contains heat absorbing materials like your concrete or corrugated iron surfaces. And only about 25% of these taxi ranks had any form of shelter. And this is a specific public health concern in the city of Durban, as recent studies and research have found that all-cause mortality actually increases significantly above the 30.6 degrees Celsius mark. And this is a threshold that the drivers and commuters are frequently exposed to. Adding on to this, the hotter temperatures actually coincide with the higher commuter volumes. So technically, or most of the time during your afternoon session, when your peak commuter volumes are high, temperatures are also extremely high. And this is where the greatest discomfort and health risks are faced. So in parallel to the physical data collection, we also did some interviews with taxi drivers and commuters to understand how they perceive and respond to heat on a daily basis. So straight away, the drivers and commuters feel significantly hotter inside the taxis. They feel that over time and over prolonged heat exposure, they feel fatigued, and specifically for drivers, there's reduced concentration. So it's impacting the driver performance and the risk of driving errors. And most of them only rely on basic coping strategies and mechanisms to stay cool, but mainly for temporary relief, like opening windows, drinking water, and parking in the shade. What's really exciting that's come out of this study, and I've said it's evidence to action, is this study has actually have a demand-driven awareness and engagement across the sector. So a taxi heat awareness campaign has come out, and it's been co-developed with the taxi drivers and taxi associations. And it's now being piloted in 2 cities of Tshwane and Durban. And ultimately, these materials just help improve understanding of heat risks and promote some practical low-cost actions to reduce exposure. And you can see some of the materials there on the right. And these efforts have also now been scaled up towards a more province-wide public awareness campaign that is now going to be undertaken under the Gauteng Heat Action Plan program, which is currently underway in South Africa. So beyond this, investment options also range from vehicle modifications to the design of heat-resilient taxi ranks. So whether it be upgrading vehicles to reduce heat exposure or design heat-resilient transit hubs that improve cooling, shade, and comfort for commuters. So focusing on the modifications for taxis, the first one that came out was the engine repositioning. So currently the engine sits beneath the driver's seat. So there's a lot of radiation coming up from below. So the idea is to move the engine and redesign and modify the taxis to reduce that heat burden. Reducing the solar radiation, whether it be tinting windows or having reflective windows to reduce the solar heat gain. And then improving airflow and ventilation through installing fans or vents at multiple points to improve airflow with open windows to allow ventilation. And then moving towards the design options for the taxi ranks. So there's limited access to drinking water available at any of the taxi ranks observed. So the idea is to install taps and drinking fountains for commuters and drivers to stay hydrated, expand the shade infrastructure using either tree planting, shelters, or reflective roofing materials, and also establishing cooling centers in and around taxi ranks where drivers and commuters can rest in shaded and cool spaces. So ultimately, it's a call for action to build cooler and safer taxi sector. So cooler, safer taxis mean healthier drivers and commuters and more comfortable journeys. Simple vehicle upgrades can reduce heat stress. The shaded and cool taxis create more livable and user-friendly public spaces. Clear communication and awareness can really empower and drive behavior change. Reducing heat stress improves productivity, concentration, and ultimately safety on the road. And investing in heat resilience is not just about comfort, but it's about protecting people and their livelihoods. That's all from my side in this very quick time. But thank you so much again for the opportunity, and I'll be open for any questions that follow. Thanks.
Much, Bradley, for presenting these very pragmatic solutions to the important topic. Now, we have two discussions, Arturo Adila, lead transport economist, and Abigail Baca, lead DRM specialist, who will give some views of from their respective fields. And afterwards, we open the floor to everyone for Q&A. Abby, do you want to start with a discussion?
Sure.
Or Arturo, like whoever.
As you choose.
Arturo, are you connected?
Yes, I am. Hello from Kampala in Uganda.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for making it from Uganda to the meeting. Maybe, Arturo, you can go ahead. We have the connection going.
Okay, thank you. So first reaction is we need more complete streets. I heard a lot about trees, but in my visit not only to Kampala, last week I was with Akiko in Nairobi and other cities, the lack of sidewalks is the beginning of the problem. And a complete street is by definition a street that has a proper sidewalk, hopefully 1.5 meters wide, the walking area, so that two wheelchairs fit in parallel, plus at least 1 more meter for trees. I heard a lot about the need for more trees, but many cities lack the basic layout on the roads for placing a tree. So no wonder many cities are missing trees. If the sidewalk has never been built, the road exists, the parking happens, but the sidewalk is not there, affecting the pedestrians, exposing them not only to traffic, but to the heat that we are discussing today. So we need more projects, I would argue, that build complete streets, of course, with proper traffic management, and plant trees, native, of course, indigenous to the respective area, that provide shade, that have the correct height, that don't impede the street lights from illuminating at night to provide safety for all pedestrians at night. And here the point is that tree selection in public areas is a science and an art in of itself. My second reaction is on Bradley's presentation, and it's more a question if it would be worthwhile to think about what is an agenda at the World Bank of formalizing informal transport. And when Bradley said to replace the units with tinted windows, with maybe better ventilation, yes, but if we're going to have, again, a taxi that sits 12 to 14 people and a driver that works 12 hours a day driving and might then fold as mechanic for light maintenance, with maybe 2 more hours of work a day, which we have seen in other cities that have this competition in the market, this penny war, as they call it in my home country in Colombia, because it's a war for every additional passenger. And the work shifts are inhumane, regardless of the temperature, actually. And if you improve the comfort with a new vehicle, but you left the driver working 12 hours a day, having to go to the restroom on a tree, if it exists, instead of in a proper facility, unable to take breaks, whereas with formalization and public transport reform, labor laws apply. So in many countries, drivers cannot drive more than 6 hours in a row. Their break has to be at a proper place with proper restrooms, with ping pong tables, billiards, etc., a place to nap. Would it be worthwhile? You spoke about 60 million trips a day, which is incredible. Of course, it has to be gradual. And I finish by saying this. Bradley did not mention other health impacts from sitting down in a warm environment. Particularly for men, it's not good for any gender, but for men, it can have reproductive impacts, basically impossibility to conceive children. So there are other health implications that call for the necessity to reform and modernize, and formalize public transport. The examples that we have seen, the drivers have always won. Sometimes the number of drivers employed has increased, and their welfare definitely has improved. Of course, reforms must benefit above all the user, the passenger. So it's about the passenger, but there is a huge co-benefit with the drivers. Thank you very much.
Avi, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for organizing this and for sharing this really excellent publication and having these great case studies, both coming from Africa, which is excellent to see because that's sort of building out the evidence and experiences from other regions that can benefit our global portfolio. From the DRM perspective, I think there's growing awareness that heat waves are a very important hazard that need to come more into focus as we're looking at the growing impacts that we see from climate crises. So I think this approach specific to the transport sector starts to show the entry points and the tools that are available for integrating heat and its impacts for better planning, policy making, and the investment phase that is very critical for us in our operations. I would say yes. So one is endorsing that heat waves must be part of a multi-hazard approach to building resilience. I also really appreciate having these two case studies that bring sort of the formal investment and infrastructure case of a large urban transport system, and then also this perspective of the informal transport and users and services that we know are very present in the cities in which we work. Looking at the first presenter's points and understanding how this was approached in the publication, I think it's really helpful to start to see the direct and indirect impacts that heat has on the transport sector, and not just on the infrastructure itself, but most critically on the users and their ability to access these services. So I think we're all aware of sort of the life cycle approach with infrastructure, and this critical pathways tool, I think is very useful to integrating into the way we approach having the right tools for doing planning that is sort of region and country specific. I think will be really important as you roll out this work to start to build out examples of the costs that are incurred in these environments, the hazard profiles that different cities face. So I appreciate that Nairobi's hazard profile for heat looks very different than maybe Maputo's hazard profile for heat. So that's an excellent step in the critical pathways. I also think it's important to think about the cost and feasibility of the different alternatives that have to be in place, that have to be considered in the planning phase of integrating resilience building solutions into the transport systems, and that these will also need to be adapted for the different contexts. Having a tool that helps the planners at the urban scale do the cost benefit analysis and have that integrated into a multi-sector planning exercise for heat resilience, I think is critical. We had the Cooling Cafe, which brought together the urban and transport sectors at the annual meeting, which was a really great space for these discussions. And we're seeing that just building trees around a station maybe in and of itself would have a lot of cost implications for that transport investment. But if it's put into the broader context of a city's strategy for building climate resilience, you start to see greater dividends, not just for the transport service, but for the community. And that was highlighted in both of the case studies as well. So bringing this into the conversations we have on livability at the city scale is critical. From a DRM perspective, we're always thinking about extremes. And so when I appreciated having sort of the color coding to show what are the different stress levels and heat scenarios, and my eyes, of course, go to the red. What are we going to do in those cases where we really have an increasing number of extreme heat days that are dangerous for the people and the infrastructure, when maybe the physical solutions for mitigating that might become more cost prohibitive, or we need to have strategies that are maybe non-structural to complement those structural resilience measures in the transport system. And this is where early warning systems and tools become very, very important. How can you identify and anticipate when you have these extreme heat conditions reaching the cities and countries? What are the contingency plans that authorities and users can have? How is that communicated? How do the alerts reach the range of users and beneficiaries of the system? So I think that's another good opportunity for collaboration in the more traditional DRM space, is thinking about what early warning systems and platforms, how they need to adjust for this type of hazard. So I'll just conclude with that, but I've really appreciated the opportunity and found the discussion very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avi and Arturo, for putting it in the sector perspective and also showing where more work needs to be done for us to be able to mainstream these interventions. Now, I will open the floor now to the audience. So if you are online, feel free to raise your hand and we go by the order of your hand raised. And if there are questions in the room.
Xavier raised her hand.
Okay, maybe we start with Xavier and then the next one. Xavi, welcome.
Hello, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. So just a question. Look, I always think about the heat wave in summer because all the time in the news there is a report on a kid being killed inside a car because a heat stroke, and it's something that worries me a lot. And I know that we could do something as a practice, but I wanted to ask Professor if during his review, his panel, he came across this topic of people being killed inside cars because of heat stroke, and if so, how could we frame it as a sector, right? Because it's not an infrastructure issue. It may be something that is behavioral, but how could we address this issue that is killing people all over the world as well every summer? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't think we have come across where, yeah, the heat was someone was trapped in a vehicle and then there was a direct fatality because of that. I mean, we have seen some media reports of young children actually happening by accident. I don't think that was but I think there are a lot of indirect effects, as one of the speakers did mention, due to the heat, exposure to heat of being in a vehicle, right? So continuous exposure for a very long periods of time, like 8 to 12 hours and more, right, causes a lot of health issues, dehydration issues, and long-term health issues as well, as Arturo actually mentioned. So I think there are those are very well documented in our report, and we have seen a lot of those types of instances.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi.
There was one comment. There was one comment, a question in the chat, and it was a question related to from Jean Charles about setting priorities without some kind of a cost benefit analysis. Is there any research showing how a quantitative framework could actually be developed related to that? So I could answer that question. So we have not seen, we have seen specific cost benefit analysis for specific technologies. For example, the IoT technologies for better sensing of tracks related to buckling. There have been studies which have looked at the cost and benefits of using that type of an IoT sensor for buckling purposes. So that's a specific technology which has actually been evaluated, and the costs and benefits have been computed. So we have seen, I think, like maybe 3 or 4 specific technologies where this type of a benefit cost analysis has actually been done. But this is specific to one technology. What our framework in this report actually does is to kind of give a more broader context to how to do this cost benefit, not using deterministic costs, but to really look at this future different pathways that are actually there, right? And then you can kind of do a cost benefit analysis depending upon the type of technology options, not just one technology, but you can kind of really look at a set of options that you actually want to involve, right? And then you can kind of really look at a cost benefit analysis for all of those things together. So our framework kind of gives us a way to kind of do that, right? But we haven't done a specific location, a specific set of technologies, and computed the cost benefit analysis. That would be the next step once we identify a region, once we identify a case study. That's where we can actually do that type of an exercise.
Thank you, Satish. You wanted to ask your question?
Yeah, so thank you for the speakers. And just to introduce myself, because I don't really know anyone in the room, I'm Christelle Haddad. I'm in the Transport LAC team currently. And also I see Xavier was introduced to him virtually, but we are doing the work, I don't know if Alina is online, but on the link between road safety and climate resilience. And I was also told about this meeting, which I think is very on point. And from that angle, and I heard a lot about the, increased risk for the driver and, the infrastructure is more deteriorated. I was curious if for any of the speakers, in the cases, let's say for Cairo, Senegal, or South Africa, if there was any specific finding, maybe not necessarily like someone in the car that died, but even in the public transport, if there was any direct link between the heat wave and like some road safety sort of hazard, that it was documented this way. That's the first question. If I can ask just 2 more quick ones. The second one on the study that Bradley presented on one of the actions with the engine repositioning, I think it was that. So I was thinking this is something more for like kind of the car manufacturers. Is there something that is out there, or how can we push for that? Like what is the, how can it happen? And the third one is to the point of the cost benefit analysis, what, I was mentioned, what also Abigail mentioned. I understand that, but then in that cost benefit analysis, is there like a way to think of the timeline in the sense what is short term, medium term, long term? Because some things, even if it's cost effective, it might take longer to see the fruit of it. So I don't know if that was done.
Sorry for the many questions, but it's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know who wants to take any answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in first on those. No, thanks so much for the questions. On the first one, looking at kind of heat waves and if they're related to vehicle kind of accidents or deaths, I think there's a lack of quality data specifically trying to attribute heat and deaths together. I think globally this is still a misunderstood kind of dynamic that there's still a lot of studies investigating. And how do we actually know that a death has been caused by heat and it might be attributed to other things. And specifically in a South African context, the health data is a lack of quality there. So reliance on that health data makes those kind of analytics even harder. And then on your point on kind of vehicle modifications and how do we kind of make those changes. So what's great about, I think, the South African industry, and I actually want to also jump on, Arturo had added a point on formalizing the informal transport sector. But interesting enough, in the South African context, we actually say the minibus taxi sector is a formalized informal sector. So it's very much a formalized sector, but in a very informal way, let me rather put it. So there's a lot of engagement between the taxi association and your departments of transport and roads. So this work has actually fed back into that loop, and it's definitely gone to kind of policy recommendations on how we can have better design guidelines for vehicle modifications. But it's been a demand-driven real approach. So it's really from bottom up and trying to drive kind of the health perspective. But there is still those connections and dynamics working between the kind of formalized Department of Transport and the informal taxi sector.
Thank you.
Let me just add one extra data point for what Bradley added related to relationship between heat and crashes. What we have seen is heat actually causes more distraction to drivers, resulting in crashes. And every 1.8 degrees increase in temperature results in about 2% increases in the crash rate, right? So there was a study which kind of quantified crash rate with increasing temperatures, right? So there is definitely a strong correlation between increasing temperatures and crash risk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe to answer the CBA question, this is typically the project life cycle. So our team has done something similar for nature-based solutions where we map every intervention to a cost. And I think we can maybe replicate this exercise for extreme heat. But then for us at the World Bank level, like we will look at the project life cycle and could see how we can integrate that. Yes.
I thought of one other comment, and that's not only during operation, but also during construction. I know on our safeguards, we're also becoming more aware in operational health and safety standards of when it's unsafe for construction activities to be undertaken, right? And in some of these places where you're going to have more of these days with extreme heat, you're going to shrink the time when you can conduct the construction of transport infrastructure and the maintenance. So I know there's some strategies to shift to more night work scenarios, which will have other costs, but that could be interesting also sort of for an operational discussion within our own projects as we're planning them with our counterparts as we're thinking about the growing importance of these health and safety standards and the implementation of our projects as well.
And if I may add to that response too on the cost benefit. So when we were doing the peer review of the report, some of the comments from and the recommendation from those comments was that, so we compiled the evidence, we have this literature review, have this discussion on what we know, right? But it would be great if us, through engagements with task teams, clients that are interested in this, we also develop a lot more of like that knowledge of how to do it and kind of more, I would say, standardized way of approaching as we have developed the knowledge in collaboration between the transport DRM urban colleagues on flood resilience. So that was a lot of the messaging recommendations also from the peer reviewers that like, and part of the motivation to work on this is that there's still a lot to be done in terms of developing that knowledge of like how do we quantify that basically comprehensively as like you pointed.
Thank you.
So if I may, my name is Jin Shou, I'm a senior transport specialist working in the global unit. So we collaborated a little bit on this, and I was one of the peer reviewers. So I think most of our risk assessment in the transport system focus on the big events like flooding, like landslides, or sea level rise. So heat is chronic, less visible, less detectable, and receive less attention in the past decades. However, I think with the global warming and extreme heat, for example, my hometown in Nanchang, end of September, temperature was 43 in China. It's really, really unacceptable. And people are really suffering from all kinds of activities, including commuting, taking bus, whatever. So I think our transport global practice recently published a guidance note. Is a disaster climate resilient transport system guidance note, which covers many hazards, including heat. However, our note is like comprehensive, including many hazards, so it's not as detailed and as this one. So I think this work comes really in time because this provides a lot of principles and very literature review. 1,000 papers was reviewed, and a group of experts who participated in this report together, I think gives us a very good foundation to understand better how heat impacts our transport system and how we can address these challenges in our systems. It's a great presentation by a professor, and also the 2 case studies brings a lot of realities for us to think how we can operationalize these principles and how we can do more. So I want just to suggest maybe 2 or 3 things that we can collaborate in the near future. One is on, identify these case studies where, railway be urban rail or urban corridors where, heat are most challenging to address. And we can do more in these areas, identify, I will be happy if we do something in my hometown to address 43 degrees. So we can continue collaborating on this area and maybe also compile a very easy checklist on screening. What are, if you prepare a project in a city that's high temperature in the summer, these are the things you need to look at. Maybe just a quick risk screening list, and then also bring these to disseminate with the TTOs who are facing these challenges in their client cities or countries. I think this will be our direction to collaborate in the near future. Thank you. I think this is a really great work. Thank you so much.
We have some questions online.
Yes, we have some questions online, and thank you, Jing. I think this also addresses a little bit a question. One of the questions we have online, like how does the transport project planning and financing ensure that heat wave impacts are considered? Well, right now it's not being done systematically, and that's exactly why this report exists, why we are hosting this event, and we will reach out from our team to task team leaders in the regions to make sure that wherever there's an opportunity, an entry point, we collaborate and we catch all these low-hanging fruits that are there, and that we build more and more evidence. So we have 2 more questions online here. One is, does the report discuss any particular heat resilience investments technology specific to the health sector transportation, that is EMS, referral, cold chain? I think that's for Satish, this question.
No, we don't. We don't discuss specifically to EMS or cold chain. Yeah, we don't do that here.
Can I add something?
Yes,
and
please.
just to add to that question is that part of, the spectrum of all the different transport modes and in the relation with heat is quite large, right? And so what we cover here was more focused on that transport systems, like in that relation with the user too, or some connections also with the workforce. So we didn't focus on like the impact, for example, more on supply chains type of transportation. It was more the passenger type, or where there is potentially a challenge also for example, the drivers, right? Like, so that interaction with the people using or managing the transport system. And then yeah, so that's part of, I would say, an area that like that would not be covered in this report. Definitely there are implications there too. Another sector we didn't cover mainly because a part of that is for example, ports, infrastructure, maritime transport, and that was also some area that we also received some comments, but it was not covered in the initial scope.
Yeah, but while we don't cover specifically to EMS or cold chain or supply chains, many of the technologies that we actually have reviewed are transferable to those settings, right? So we have not connected those dots specifically, but yeah, we can kind of see that they would be transferable because many of those vehicles or transport systems like ports have similar challenges that we actually have seen, right? So those technologies are transferable. But in the report, we have not connected those dots. We have not done a specific review for these types of vehicles or modes of transportation.
Thank you. And one last question we have online from Charles. Along that point, are there methods, tools that the transport vertical uses to model heat disruptions to accessibility of public services? No, Charles, like to my knowledge, I mean, this is based on what Jing has said. This is like a chronicle and persistent hazard. So this is typically not modeled in our planning.
Yeah. So as Nicola mentioned earlier, that we have done a great job in doing the vulnerability assessment for the roads exposure to flooding, to landslides, and sometimes also earthquake when the risk is also high in that corridor region. But heat is usually not considered. However, in our upgrading of HDM5, which is our very long-term used planning tool, in this upgrading, we are trying to bring the heat into the consideration in two levels. One is at the asset level, how heat, temperature change deteriorate the pavement rather quickly. So there's a new pavement deteriorator model that considers a future climate scenario. And the other way is at the higher level, at the network level. We are trying also to see how we can take into consideration of the heat. For now, it's only landslides and flooding in the network level, but we need to, once we have the HTM5 upgrades completed, we can always bring in more modules, more hazard into the analysis. I think we have to face the reality that 45, 43 degrees in September may come next year and the next 10 years. So we need to be prepared and be proactive in taking these actions. So that's very relevant. So integrating this risk model into the transport system is what we are pursuing. Just depends on the financing and interest, how quick we can get there. That's the problem. But at least we are equipped with the principles, with the case studies, and then we can build the tools together so we can help and be prepared.
Thank you. Two more questions. Okay. Well, we have an answer from Lalip here, actually noting that some South American countries have started to plan for air-conditioned ambulances in the future. That's good to know, relating to the other question. And then Daniel asked, how could the bank incentivize or promote the improvement of public transport in a meaningful way? And he says, the state of public transport in many emerging economies is often the result of complex economic and political factors, where the lack of consistent involvement from authorities is a recurring issue. In most cases, public transport systems remain poorly planned or insufficient to meet growing demand. Given these challenges, what specific actions can the bank take and include in our reports to encourage private investment in public transport infrastructure and services.
That question could be for me.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'm right now in a car. I'm not driving, rest assured. But the bottom line is that public transport reform is complex. You have to involve the local stakeholders. You have to involve as much as possible the existing operators in the reformed industry, which will use different buses, larger, but also use more labor because of the formalization and the real formalization. Bradley described this formality within informality in South Africa. So the two key pillars are to change the way the cash flows. If the cash, the fare box continues to be pocket cash, you didn't achieve much. Even if it's electronically collected as in Kenya, thanks to M-Pesa, every day the driver sees in his or her account the money, it's pocket cash, doesn't work. You have to have change the periodicity of remuneration to say every 7 days, so that the fleet and the driver can rest 1 day. On average, buses operate 6 days a week on average, so there's always service to the user, and the bus goes to maintenance once a week, and the driver rests at least once a week. The other pillar is that if you're going to ask investors to buy new buses, maybe electric that are more expensive, etc., you have to protect them from the predatory competition. That is what we call competition in the market, the penny war, as we coined that term in Colombia. So you have to protect them. Curitiba taught us that splitting the city into 10 different zones and giving an exclusive right to operate the buses to one company in each zone worked, and they have a world-class system that inspired many cities. They invented BRT, as you might remember. There are other ways, but the bottom line is, again, change the cash flow. Cannot be pocket cash. And secondly, protect the new investors from the predatory competition. So switch to somehow competition for the market, or something where there are barriers to entry that prevent the predatory competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. So we have no more questions in the chat and 5 minutes left. Thank you so much to all the speakers, to the discussants, to the audience for the questions. Obviously, reach out with more questions, with ideas for support with integrating heat into your projects. And I'm handing over to Natalia for closing remarks.
Thank you, Erica. And adding to that appreciation also, thank you to all the urban DRM and transport colleagues who contributed to this work and also organizing this session, and everyone who joined and was part of this engaging discussion. That was very nice. So I think today we've seen that there is compelling evidence. We've heard about practical solutions of addressing that heat risk in transport systems. The case studies reminding us that those solutions and those assessments should be coming from like that, grounded on like that local context, and also robust data. And I think also that was part of a lot of the message that we heard from Arturo and Abby in their discussion. And so, as I mentioned before, that part of working on this, part of like that, the motivation also to having this session is also to encourage all of us to basically move forward, supporting our clients in that dialogue on like what is better data collection, the analytics, like the methodologies to assess that economic impact, making that case for that investing in resilience to heat waves. Of course, when it matters, right? Like when it's relevant. Also exploring the basically new technologies, materials, like the benefit of like passive cooling solutions, other urban planning interventions, and also
above all, also keep in mind that aspect of equity, how those adaptation measures also address the vulnerability of like those people that are the most vulnerable users, and also the workforce in the transportation system. So I mean, this has said several times in this session, the risk is rising, but I think that there is a lot of opportunity in this special space to innovate and then collaborate to identify those solutions. I mean, across GPs, but also being partnered with our clients doing that. And as he has mentioned, and so we GFDR in Durham, we're here to support and to help with that planning, that technical assistance delivering. And I'm sure from the transport GP is the same. So reach out to us if you have any questions, you see any interest in your clients and need some support on that. We focus a lot on the urban setting, but the report also covers aspects that are outside the urban setting. Part of the focus on the urban setting, I think, is because basically heat waves are particularly affecting cities, and that interaction with the user and the workforce would tend to happen more in cities. But there are also interventions and relevance for transport infrastructure outside the city context too. And so we would be also happy to engage with the teams that are looking into that too, in a multi-hazard approach or like more specific assessment as relevant. And so just basically my last point is just thank you everyone again. Thank you, Rebecca, for organizing and Faustina too. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.